Doki Doki Literature Club. Why were you so happy at the end of our last episode when you knew that all of a sudden I'd be playing this game?
Well, we were talking about whether games need to be fun and what fun in a game is. And I don't know if there's a better example of a game that maybe isn't fun than Doki Doki. And it's free. It's a cultural phenomenon in of itself. Highly recommend people to give it a try. Um, yeah, so I couldn't wait to see what you thought of it.
What if I told you that I had a lot of fun playing this game? Like
That would be very
the
interesting.
the first 4 hours were not as fun. So let's just say right off the top, there's going to be spoilers. So there's two disclaimers we should have, which are really one and the same. There will be spoilers, and we will be talking about suicide um, and some dark stuff that comes up in the game, right? Which the game is actually very careful of telling you right off the bat that this is coming. It does it multiple times. It has a disclaimer saying you have to be over 13 years of age, or you commit to being over 13 years of age, as if you're 6 and you decide to be 13, you're magically 13. No, that you are 13 years of age and you're happy dealing with not happy dealing with this content. I should have just read the disclaimer from the actual game, but that this kind of content is coming and to be prepared for it, which I found interesting because that disclaimer made me more interested in what was to come. I was looking for it. I was looking for the horror. I was looking for what was going to scare me. I was looking for dark themes. And for the first 4 hours, I was looking for it in places that it probably wasn't there, but it propelled me more into the game. It kind of reminded me of the movie Fargo, which at the start says this story is based on true events, which is not true. It is not based on, well, it's based on the truth of people, but it is not based on a true story. It's almost a trick that the filmmakers did, the Coen brothers did, to bring us into that world and to be looking for it and to be seeing it in a way as in this really happened, which affects our understanding of it. And so, in the same way with Doki Doki or Doki Doki or however you pronounce that, I was looking for these things and it affected my viewing. That being said, the first 4 hours were a bit of a grind because at that time it's a dating sim, essentially, drawing from Japanese culture. It represents or it feels like Japanese visual novels, which I'm not used to at all. And it's a lot of reading. The very few choices that you do make influence what you get to see, not how the story progresses, who you get to talk to, what images you see them in, how things progress with your relationships with them. But really, the story is the same. You're reading the same novel no matter what. So that was it was interesting, but doing it for 4 hours was not as fun. But then it gets fun and very there are so many levels. Let's just say it. When Sayuri kills herself, um, there's a lot of levels to that event, not just in the revelation of her death and seeing that image of her hanging in her bedroom and all of that that's leading up to that, but also feeling, did I make this happen? Was this because of things that I did or that I said? Could I have prevented this from happening? I can't load my saved game too. The saved games have been deleted at that point. So I can't go back, which is such an interesting comment about video games, that we have this sensation as we play that it's okay, I can go back. It's okay, I can go back and change things. It's okay, I can just start over from the beginning. There's even that at times the game frustrates. You can't just start over because the game files have been changed by Monica, but really by the creators of the game. So, anyways, um, really, really interesting. And I've been thinking about it a lot since I finished, but especially since I came to that juncture.
I had a lot of fun watching you in the early bits of that. You did stream a tiny bit of just the first couple hours, and I could see that you were prompted to play this game, so you wouldn't have gone into it not really knowing that something was up. And as you said, the game gives you a bunch of warnings and trigger warnings before playing, which I completely understand and support the game developers doing that. I also 100% think that the game would have been more of an amazing art piece if they didn't. Of course, they have to, and I understand why those trigger warnings have to be there. But I think the point of the game was that you would have no idea, that nobody playing the game would have any idea what was coming. And I think that it would have had obviously an even stronger impact if one really didn't know and they really thought they were playing just a visual novel, dating sim. Um, and I actually think that part of the reason why it's such a slog in the early bit is that it tries to lull you into a false sense of security again. I think the game tries to and it almost works. Like again, I've seen people play through it, and every time I know what the game is, and yet you almost start to just buy into the story and the characters and everything that's happening, and you almost forget that the shoe's going to drop. Um, and I almost think that's why they had such a grind, because the only way that they could really sell this, and the only people that were going to stick through with this for that long were maybe exactly the ones that they were trying to shock and the ones that they were trying to get some sort of message across. Of course, now the game itself is a cultural phenomenon and people know about it. And usually it's somebody like me telling a friend to go play it. Has a different sort of impact and people go into it a different way. But I think when it first came out and when people were first playing it, it really was a subset of people who played visual novels. And at the end of the day, it's still a lot of those people that are told to go play it because it subverts so many of the tropes and cliches in that genre.
Yeah, and looking into the game after playing it, I've realized just how late to the party I am. Like this was a big deal in 2018, and people still play it. There are streamers still who still do this, and a lot of people like me who are unspoiled with this game. But we're certainly past the cultural moment, which is for me totally normal. I am past many cultural moments. I'm not engaged with whether it's games or movies or um, television series, whatever. Like many things that I'm watching now are from 7 years ago, and people are like, "Yeah, I know, I've had that conversation. I don't care anymore. I've moved on 7 steps from you." And Doki Doki feels a little bit like that, but because it's in a way a classic game, like sorry, not classic game. It's basic graphics. It's very basic graphics, basic music. Even the character development is relatively basic in the game. Like it's not going into vast distances to explain who these people are, where they come from. And because of that, I don't feel like playing today is going to be any different from playing 10 years from now, which is a nice feeling. But it's an interesting dilemma that the developers of this game, particularly Dan Salvato, who is the main guy behind it, had to grapple with, because for the first 4 hours or however long it takes you, you're in a world that has not been popped. You're in a bubble that has not been popped. You're in a place that has not been disturbed. It feels like a very genuine, almost wholesome simulator of being in a literature club with 4 girls and talking to them and spending time with them. And it's really mostly that. And you can look for the little things and the scary parts as much as you want, but you're not going to find them. But they still had to make that interesting. So one thing that's interesting is all of the girls, except for maybe Monica, although you discover this in Monica as well at the end, battle with a sort of depression, or at least a form of high school anxiety, especially Sayori, who kills herself, but also Yuri, also Natsuke, who are troubled people, troubled girls, maybe troubled in a normal way, maybe troubled in a way that every other high school girl is troubled. Like I, the main character, am troubled in my life. But it elevates that to a point that it becomes interesting. And when things happen in the second half, you can tie the strings back to all of the things that were said in the beginning. There are clues that even if they were invisible to me before the pivotal moment, they are still very much present in the game.
So, one thing, and I don't know how much you've looked into it so far, but one thing that's really interesting about that is the main premise of the game, as I understand it, is that it was a regular, normal visual novel dating sim game. The whole game is a meta game. So there was a visual novel called Doki Doki Literature Club, and the characters had nothing dark or sinister or anything. They didn't even have depression. All the characters were just these normal, sweet kind of girls where there was some drama and everything that you kind of see near the beginning. And all of the other bits are actually written by Monica. So that's the implication as I know it, is that Monica herself, a character in the game, gains sentience, falls in love with the player, and starts rewriting the game. And so as a game developer and a writer yourself, to see, right, there's this almost that she thought the game, the characters were boring. She thought that the situation and everything was kind of bland. And in fact almost comments on it in the earlier parts of the game where things are like, where something happens and she just kind of she has that air of, her character happens to be the leader of the club, so she kind of gets to say this, but she kind of glosses over things that other characters say that she doesn't really find that interesting or that relevant to continue dwelling on, and tries to push the story forward. So I don't know if you've thought of the game through that lens. That's my understanding from what I've read about it, is that the idea is Monica literally rewrote their characters. So she started going into their files and started writing them to be more depressed, literally caused Sayori to commit suicide. All of this stuff that she wrote into the game that was not part of their original code. And how do you feel about that when we're talking about the story, when we're talking about the characters and the writing, and is it deep or not? Because there is this meta depth, right, where they had this difficulty of, okay, we're going to kind of write a boring game, but it's going to be a lot deeper, and maybe not because of the words you see on the screen, but
Yeah.
because of the implication of where that comes from.
Absolutely. So there are two things there. First of all, yes, I did kind of get that sense, although not as sophisticated as you just laid it out. I was, there was a point at which I thought, oh, this isn't a dating simulator for me. This is a dating simulator for Monica. This is a method for her to find people like me to play this game so that she can trap us in this world and force us into choosing her in the end and all of the stuff that happens. And so I found that an interesting switch, because in no way in the end is this a dating simulator, which, by the way, I don't even really know what that is. It's just things that I've read that it mimics dating simulators. I've never played a dating simulator before, but I can understand how this is representative of that. But to the second point about how this is written, I find that wonderful. I really like that sense of, first of all, the twist, right? Almost all good stories come with some sort of twist, especially short stories. The classic form of a short story, if you think of Chekhov in the 19th century, was to have normalcy slightly out of balance and then a twist where everything you thought is flipped on a dime at the end of the story, right before or right at the very end of the story. In this, there are multiple twists that occur. Sayori's death, but then, of course, at the end, the revelation of Monica being the sort of puppeteer of all of this, the now sentient, definitely sentient and definitely meta character in the game. And there are twists in her towards the end, and the different restarts of the game that occur all the way up until the end as well. And so I love that. And I also love that it's a comment on playing games itself. Up until the first half of the game, I was, again, searching for this and found it interesting because I knew that there was more than what I was seeing, but I was lulled into thinking maybe there isn't. I've been playing this for 4 hours, and I think I asked you in the when I was streaming on Twitch, I think I asked you, how far are we into this? Or maybe I asked you after the stream was ended, how far are we? And you said, oh, we're just over halfway. And I'm like, oh God. Okay. So it must be right in front of me. Maybe it's in the poetry that I'm reading that the girls are giving to me. Because surely the interesting stuff is going to happen in the first quarter, or the first third of this game. And then it wasn't. And I thought, okay, I'm missing it. I've got to be more analytical with these poems. I've got to be more interested in these characters and spend more time with them. And then, of course, regardless of what I do, that twist comes. But I really appreciate how again, this is when form and content come together. So when form and content become the exact same thing, when the commentary of the game and playing games becomes what's happening with the game becomes corrupted. The sprites on the screen become a little bit off color. You get sudden shocks of a face appearing different than it was before. The language becomes corrupted. There's a whole sequence, again, another spoiler, after Yuri kills herself, where you have to essentially press the skip button and wait for 5 minutes until all the text comes through. That's a comment. It's not there. I can't analyze the writing because I can't understand the writing. It's encrypted. And I find that when form and content comes together, as we've talked about you and me before, Lammy, about what makes good art, that's often a piece of good art when the content and the form are essentially the same thing. And I found that was happening here more than I expected.
Like as a person who doesn't play horror games, and that's not what I'm as into, even though oftentimes the horror genre, whether in film, in writing, in video games, it often actually is this more meta commentary about something. And horror is just the medium and the format that they choose to tell it because it evokes such strong feelings. And I'm starting to get that. I think I'm starting to appreciate horror as a genre more. But in general, I would never have played this game if it was just a horror game, even in the way that it is. The meta elements for me are what made it really interesting. As a person who loves video games, is interested in development, is a developer, um, thinking about what they're trying to say about gaming and how they're trying to, break the fourth wall completely by talking about the game files and literally forcing you to go into the game files and, doing all of these things, even just getting rid of your saves. Like all of this stuff is what really, really drew me in. And that the horror is, again, it's a good fit for this because it gives you that emotional punch in one way that affects you on a real life emotional level, and then it gives you the twist on the gaming format, which is another kind of hit. It's not quite that same emotional hit in the horror way, and I think it just stun locks you almost, right? That's the game. It has this effect, which I think good art that maybe isn't always fun, which is where we came at this from, right? And you said you had fun, but I think the kind of fun you had was that fun I talked about where something was surprising. You were presented with a pattern and you
Yeah.
learned something that you've never encountered before, and that's fun. But it was almost like a stun locking effect. There were so many things happening. There were so many different layers that the developers managed to get at with this game, and all of it from a format, right? This dating sim visual novel that you would especially never expect it from.
Yeah, I think especially for people like in the things that I've read for so visual novels are still very popular in Japan. They may have reached their peak, but it's a statistic I've heard before, but in 2006, 70% of visual novels, or sorry, 70% of games in Japan were visual novels, which is a huge amount. That's, more than just the majority. That's a strong majority of games. And that's a culture that can not only understand a game like this and appreciate what it's trying to do, but be shocked by it in a way that is more surprising, more revealing, more deep cutting than a surprise that it was for you and me. And yet it was still a powerful surprise. When you say I had fun in that surprising way, you're exactly right. That is the kind of fun that I was having. It was a fun that I never have playing games, but it is a kind of fun I have frequently when reading a book or watching a film. You know, when I was smiling to myself at the end of this game, I was smiling to myself quite a bit in the second half, just going, "You clever bastards." Like
Right?
this is okay. I get it. Like you're hitting me and you're making me think, and I have to sit back and kind of give kudos with a big smile for what the creators of this game are forcing me to think, how they're forcing me to be moved. Why should I be moved so much by the death of a character that I really wasn't that interested in? I didn't think, but then the dread that I was affected by. And I think another aspect to this that's interesting is this word horror. So I don't like horror movies. I don't like walking down a dark hallway with all the lights out and someone's behind me going to stab me with a knife. I don't like that feeling. I don't like being made to feel like that in a movie theater or just watching it on a screen at home. So I usually avoid that stuff, but I have to admit that a good film, a good dark film gives me horror, gives me the feeling of horror, not in a cheesy, fabricated way, but in a deep, almost existential way, in a way that is surprising. And this game did that. I don't want to play a game that's giving me scary thoughts of knives and guns and blood and gore. And yet, when it is done purposefully, like it was in this game, it hits me like Yuri's death, where she's just in bright light stabbing herself with a big knife 3 times was powerfully affecting for me.
I think being forced to sit there through the whole weekend is what really, really got me.
Hmm. That
When you
where
are doing the clicking that you were talking, you just, and it's a whole weekend, and you see her get like you, and again, the character is stun locked by this, like just shocked by the situation, and so are you playing them. Um, and I think
yeah,
the rest of the time, you don't empathize a lot with the character for the most part as the
right,
player.
right. Which is an interesting strategy too, to suddenly show you a very different kind of death than the one you saw before and force you almost away from a feeling of connection and empathy and to ask why you're feeling that. Yuri's face when she's killing herself is almost grotesque. It's not sad like Sayori's face. It's like this almost awful smile. She almost has fangs in it from what I remember from the image. There's something about that that's definitively and deliberately off-putting. And I don't know why, but I know that whatever it was trying to do was doing something to me, and that was alone effective.
We were talking earlier about format, like form and content matching. Um, and I don't know how much you've looked into it since, but this game is believed to be a precursor to a horror video game in a totally different genre. And that's the rumor. So after the game came out, people started kind of going, there's this whole idea of ARGs. I'm trying to remember what that stands for. I mean, augmented reality gaming, but I'm trying to remember if that's the right word for what I'm trying to think of. Somebody
Or
will
a,
probably correct me.
is it ARPG like action role playing game?
No, no. So I was speaking of games where there's a real life component. So a lot of games have been doing this where there's secrets within the games that are found through not the game, right? So for Doki Doki Literature Club, a lot of the game is not in the game, and that you can go into the file and read, right? Like people start looking into the code and discovering things like being told to go to particular locations, and they go to that location, and like buried in the ground there's like another video with another, and like there's like all this gaming that is outside of the video game itself. So that's been happening a lot in the last decade or so with different games. And Doki Doki had a similar thing. I'm not, things like all the encrypted text that you were skipping by, that might have been part of it, where people were able to actually figure out what that said, and it was clues to further bits of information about the game. But it is believed that potentially a horror game is coming out in a totally different genre, like a normal kind of first person or third person view, and that this game sets the stage for that. So speaking of form, they took a huge risk. They did this thing, it's storytelling, right? They chose this format specifically for this game. And there's this idea that actually these characters are going to be involved, and that there's, a whole other story that is going to be told.
I wonder if that story would be The Portrait of Markov, I think, which is the book that you read with Yuri in the game. So,
That's
which
the
is a,
thought. That is
oh,
the
okay. All
thought.
right. Well, then,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
because
the going theory.
yeah, because you're reading this book with Yuri, and it's definitely like Yuri's personality is definitely in contrast to the rest of the game. She's interested in dark things, and you think at the beginning, oh, okay, that's where they're inserting the the difficult stuff. That's where they're bringing in the content warning. It's because of Yuri and what Yuri is reading, but you never get any sense of the Portrait of Markov, other than it's like a experimental prison or something. Like for I can't remember, but yeah, that would make sense then. And so these developers are making a game that's in a way a sequel to Doki Doki, which is interesting, but very obviously very different.
Well, and we don't know. And again, this is still rumors as far as I'm aware of at this point. But it's just interesting because seeing what they did with Doki Doki, it won't just be a sequel, or right? There's gonna be more meta breaking, fourth wall breaking things somehow, right? The way it'll integrate. And that's why I think the form comment that you made is so interesting, because obviously, as game developers, they could have just made a horror game, right? Or they could have just made a visual novel and just made Doki Doki, but they're choosing kind of to introduce people to these characters, because there is thought that Yuri might come back, like some of these characters might somehow interact with that world, with that other game, or something, right? That or is it saying that that game, how are the dimensions of these game worlds existing, right? That they're somehow interacting, and that they could have just made those games, but that isn't at the end of the day the story they're trying to tell. Their story that trying to tell is something else, this meta thing.
Hmm.
And they have all these different formats that they're telling it, which we'll see if that ever comes out, if that rumor is actually true, that that's what's happening. But as far as I know, the development studio is still working on something.
But something I think well, it may not be this, but something to force me out of my expectations for what I'm doing or what I'm in, which games usually don't do. Games usually say, here's what you've got, and here's how we're going to deliver that to you. This is an RPG, this is an action RPG, this is a real time with pause simulator for managing an empire or whatever. It's promising that to you, and then if it doesn't deliver, it's a product of entertainment. So people will get mad and they'll complain and they'll ask
Mm-hmm.
for a refund, quite simply, or they'll review it poorly. And I find it interesting that some games are successful in merging genres, like having a game within a game, a visual novel that
Mm-hmm.
is a dating simulator that also is a horror metagame underneath or after the first half. And we want that. We like it when that happens. But usually, from my thin understanding of game development, when you try to have a game within a game that is a very different kind of game, so for example, you're in a standard action RPG, and then out of nowhere, you're in a puzzle that you have to solve for 2 hours that is fitting blocks together, people are going to get frustrated. That's not what
Right.
they've signed up for. But sometimes it works. Sometimes, again, when the form and content come together and it's delivering as a piece of art delivers, then it works. I found it fascinating to watch streamers play this game with their recordings on YouTube, including Dan Salvato, the developer of this game. I didn't actually watch it, but he has put out, I guess, recordings of his stream of playing Doki Doki Literature Club. But there were many who just couldn't wait to see their reactions to certain beats in the story.
Yeah.
Like, really fascinating. No idea if they were faking it or not. Like, maybe they'd been spoiled, but they were pretending not to be spoiled. There's a lot of um, histrionics, let's say, in streaming. And it's hard to separate that from the authentic emotions people have. But I found that really interesting. And of course, this is a game that probably wasn't intended to be streamed in that way, but certainly has an afterlife in that.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, because there's a part in the game where it says something about like your file system, and I think that it can actually detect if you're streaming, and then it changes the wording.
Yes, that's right. So this is what I
So
saw in some streamers. Yeah.
yeah, so I think that I don't know if they did that after the fact, or I mean, depending on, right, you said it was out in 2018. They might have known that this was going to be streamed, because they put that in, and it's become more and more common to add in those kinds of streamer modes, right? So modes that have different music rather than the intended music, because the intended music maybe isn't fair play over Twitch or something, right? All these sorts of things, or things like we don't want to accidentally dox our streamers by having them, play this, because I think it reads out your like home directory, which would be your login on your computer kind of thing, or it does something like that. That
Yeah, I did know that it exposed the fact that you were streaming towards the end. I think it's Monica that does that in things that she
yeah,
says. But that's creepy. What an interesting feeling that only certain art forms can deliver. This feeling of this thing knows things I didn't want it to know. When you watch a movie, you are very separate from this piece of art, and in rare circumstances does it envelop you and enter into your lives. And video games are an interesting area for that, especially as it moves in more into AR and VR. There are opportunities for becoming more immersive in this way, and horror and creepiness can certainly find a place in that. Yeah, there's so much to talk about. Do you think that this is a game that has replayability? I know for some people it does, but on a broad level, is this a replayable game or is one experience enough?
I think for me, one experience would be enough, because I'm one of those people where I'm there not for the horror elements, but for the surprise, for the twist, for the thinking, right? That it makes me have, and the conversations I can have with somebody else about it. Definitely watching other people experience it for the first time has a lot of that replayability factor, because my interest at the end of the day is what kinds of conversations and what thoughts does it provoke. But I wouldn't. I mean, it's a tough game emotionally. It's draining, and yeah, I wouldn't probably want. I don't think I would find the need to play it more than once in that way. And that's actually leads into what I wanted to ask you, which the fundamental question I had, and the reason I wanted you to play this game is, you said you're not a fan of horror, so you don't like this idea of just being made to feel kind of bad, or, but how do you feel about a video game where, I mean, it's intentionally making the player feel bad feelings for the purpose of what I would consider art, which is it's breaking the
Yeah.
mold, it's doing something interesting. But, would you want to play more games like that? Do you think there's a place in the world for that? Is that interesting to you as a developer? Um, because you said it was fun, but I think a lot of people would not describe it as fun. They would might maybe describe it as important, and important things are not always fun.
Yeah, but that's okay. Like, we don't all have to enjoy the same things. I mean, my answers to your question are probably yes, yes, and no. Yes, I find it fascinating as a developer, for sure. I want to create stuff that moves people, surprises them, makes them feel something they didn't expect to feel, maybe didn't want to feel. I think that's okay. That's a role of an artist, is to say, too bad. You've entered into my theater. You've walked into my studio. You're going to feel what I want you to feel. The famous adage in Buffon Clown is to do a performance for a town and try to make the mayor kill himself after. Try to make the mayor of the town kill himself. Try to give him such a profound feeling of anxiety, angst, guilt, shame, humiliation that he kills himself. And therefore, you're doing the town a favor. Now, that's maybe apocryphal or definitely paraphrasing of what Buffon Clown is, but it's one of the stories I heard about it. So, yes, I'm interested in that. Yes, I'm absolutely interested in that as an audience member or as a player, as a participant in art. I want things to move me. I want them to surprise me, and I like dark stuff. I don't like horror. I don't like things that are out to scare you for the sake of scaring you. But I want to. I like between my wife and I'm the one that's usually going to pick the movie that's hard to watch. But my answer no is again to the question about replayability. I'm only going to play this once, partly because it was so long. The film Requiem for a Dream comes to mind. So, Requiem for a Dream is a really difficult, dark, disturbing movie that I really enjoyed watching but will never see again. I don't think I'm ever going to sit myself and go through that experience yet again. And the same is true with Doki Doki, but not because Doki Doki was hard, not for the same reasons, because it was long. I don't have time to play an 8 hour game where I kind of know what the point is. I know where it's going. I would, I guess, but I'd probably be skipping through a lot of it. So yeah, I guess yes, yes, and no. But as a developer, this stuff is fascinating to me. And I think the world needs more of this. I think we need more art, games, entertainment that surprises us and makes us feel something we maybe didn't expect and maybe again didn't even want to.
So then the reason I asked is because, are you going to maybe focus on that aspect as a developer? You're going to focus more on the aspect of what is the emotional response that players would have versus does it mechanically feel good? Because I feel like that's
Yeah.
very, very rare to find a game. And Doki Doki fails at this too, because mechanically the game is not that fun to play. Again, talking about fun for a lot of people. I mean, it depends if you're a fan of dating sims and visual novels, and lots of people are. But the game still had value for the people who didn't find those mechanics fun, right? It still was an interesting experience, even for the people who didn't enjoy the gameplay loop itself. So, of course, you could have, let's say, made a game that appealed more broadly and had mechanics that were more broadly enjoyable to people and still delivered maybe the same message. But I think there is that trade off. I mean, part of why I think the message hit so hard is because it was unexpected, as we said, for the form. That maybe if you knew it was just a horror game and you were playing a regular kind of controlled character horror game, that you might expect some of this. It wouldn't be that shock, but the form made it extra shocking.
Well, and hypothetically, if this was a horror game and this was the game that was delivered, it would probably be boring by those standards as well, right? If someone who loves horror games played this, knowing what it was, I don't think they'd get much horror out of it. I don't think it would be that horrifying for them. I think the answer is in the middle. Um, yeah, I would say there is a lot of opportunity here in creating games that merge the mechanics, the fun with the rote fun of playing a game and doing something repeatedly that you love, and the surprising fun of emotional joy and emotional movement and changing the way you see the world. When those two things come together, like form and content come together, absolutely, I'm interested in that. As a writer, I'm interested in that as a nascent game developer. But that's almost like saying a painter who's interested in doing the Sistine Chapel. Like, yeah, of course you are. But that's pretty far away. I think that requires a lot of skill and experience and effort to arrive there. I think assigning a college student the Sistine Chapel would result in maybe something interesting, but not the Sistine Chapel that we know. Um, so I think it's something to aim for. Maybe it would be motivating for me to aim for that. But if I were to separate the two and say, do I want to aim for the mechanics first or aim for the emotional quality first? That's a good question because I love both, but I'm probably more capable of going for the emotion because that's my experience as a writer. I'm probably more ready to go for making people feel something through story and thought than I am through mechanics, which I'm just beginning to understand. What about you?
I think I'm definitely on the, I don't know. I think there's value in both. Like if it goes to what I'll play, I am very happy to play a game that is just really satisfying mechanically and has a lot of replayability. If it's the kind of game that has a lot of replayability, a game that is a singular sort of story with lots of impact will definitely stick with me longer. But I might play it less, objectively speaking.
Yeah, yeah, and I find that really interesting about again Requiem for a Dream, one of those films that affected me a lot when I was younger, is a film that I've put very little time into actually watching compared to some real garbage that I've seen over and over again. Isn't that interesting? I'm not, but this is again the debate between art and entertainment. So, Lammy, we're coming to the end of our time for this episode. If we were to do another game a month from now, or 4 episodes from now, whatever it turns out to be, that we could both play and get something out of, whether it's surprising or interesting, given the things that we've discussed. If you can think of it right now, what would that game be? And if you can't, that's okay. But is there a game that comes to the top of your mind that you think you and I should play, or that I should play that you've already played in the next month?
So you should already know my answer to this because I've raved about it
Outer Wilds.
forever. Yes. So I thought about it when you asked because um, I have a dirty secret, which is that I haven't been able to finish the DLC for it. I've hit kind of a barrier and a block, both emotionally and just the regular kind of thing where you haven't played it for a while, so then it gets harder to start playing it again. But I played through some of the DLC, and I really should finish because Outer Wilds pre DLC is one of the most interesting, phenomenal games I've ever experienced. It's just fascinating. Um, and I think there was some fear that what it would mean to finish the DLC that is keeping me from finishing it, plus some other quirks we can talk about. But I could finish the DLC, and if you are able to play, and this is what we'll have to figure out with your system, um, if you're able to play Outer Wilds, and we can talk about it next, whether that happens to be in a month or it takes longer to get through. It is a much longer game than Doki Doki. It's still not a long game. It's only 15 to 30 hours depending how you play, but that's a lot longer than Doki Doki Literature Club. Uh, I would choose that above any other game.
Okay, let's do it. Outer Wilds. I'm pretty sure I have the system. I'm pretty sure I can do it. And we're going to talk about it. And when we do, I promise to show up and say nothing while you spend half an hour. I know you can. I know you can. Just talking about Outer Wilds, but I'm really excited
Oh
because
my God.
You have spoken about this a lot, and it is seen as a hallmark game of making exploration not just mechanically interesting, but a vital part of storytelling. And it really is a almost a treatise on how to do that well in the development community. So it's on my list anyways, but you've just moved it to the top, and we will tackle it. I'm actually really excited.
All right. Looking forward to it.